Welcome back to a new creepypasta, Whispers in the Pines. The story begins with a group of 5 friends, Alex, Emma, Jake, Sarah, and Tom. They were close-knit since high school and had a tradition of going on a yearly camping trip to reconnect and unwind from their busy lives. This year, they decided to venture deeper into the woods than ever before, renting a secluded cabin that Emma had found online. The listing was sparse, but the pictures showed a cozy cabin surrounded by dense pines, with a crystal-clear lake nearby. The promise of solitude and nature was too tempting to pass up. The drive to the cabin took longer than expected, the winding dirt roads barely wide enough for their SUV. As they neared the cabin, the trees grew thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight, and the road turned into a narrow path barely visible under the fallen leaves. They arrived just before dusk, greeted by the sight of the cabin nestled between towering pines. The cabin was old but well-maintained. It had a rustic charm with wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and a wraparound porch. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the scent of aged wood and something else they couldn't quite place. It was cold, despite the warm weather outside, but they brushed it off as the cabin being empty for a long time. As they unpacked, Sarah found an old journal tucked between the couch cushions. The leather cover was cracked and worn, and the pages were yellowed with age. She flipped it open to find the entries written in a neat cursive hand. The first entry was dated September 23rd, 1952. "We've finally moved into the cabin. The air here is crisp and clean and the silence is almost overwhelming. I think we'll be happy here, away from the noise of the city, but there's something about the woods. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it feels like we're being watched. Robert says it's just my imagination, that I'll get used to it. I hope he's right." Sarah read the entry aloud, laughing it off as an old homeowner's paranoia. The group dismissed it as a quaint detail, something to add to the cabin's character. They didn't think much of it at the time. As night fell, they settled in around the fireplace, telling stories and drinking wine. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, creating a symphony of whispers that echoed through the night. Tom, always the prankster, pretended to hear voices in the wind, making everyone laugh nervously. But as the night wore on, the laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. The wind seemed to grow louder, more insistent, and the temperature in the cabin dropped noticeably. The fire, which had been roaring just moments before, began to die down rapidly, the flames flickering as if struggling against an unseen force. "I'll get more wood," Jake offered, eager to escape the thickening tension. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The beam of light barely penetrated the darkness, swallowed by the dense forest. The wind howled louder now, almost like a voice calling out from the trees. Jake shook his head, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. He gathered a few logs and hurried back inside. When he returned, the others were huddled together on the couch, their faces pale. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting the logs down. "We heard something," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "It sounded like someone was crying." Jake frowned, glancing at the others for confirmation. They all nodded, their expressions a mix of fear and confusion. "It's just the wind," he said, trying to sound reassuring, though he didn't quite believe it himself. He fed the fire and the flames sprang back to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. But the uneasy feeling lingered. The group decided to call it a night, retreating to their rooms. Emma and Alex took the master bedroom, while Sarah and Tom shared the second room. Jake, being the odd one out, took the small room at the end of the hall. As they settled into bed, the cabin creaked and groaned, as old houses do, but there was something different about these sounds. They were too deliberate, too rhythmic, like footsteps moving through the halls. Alex dismissed it as the house settling, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. In the middle of the night, Emma woke with a start. The room was freezing, her breath visible in the air. She reached for Alex, but his side of the bed was empty. Panic set in as she called out his name, but there was no answer. She got out of bed, wrapping a blanket around herself, and crept out into the hallway. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. She made her way to the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. As she turned the corner, she saw Alex standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. "Alex?" she called softly. He didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear her. She approached him cautiously, reaching out to touch his arm. His skin was ice cold, and he was completely still, his eyes wide open and unblinking. "Alex, what are you doing?" she asked, shaking him gently. Finally, he blinked and turned to look at her, his expression blank. I don't know," he whispered, his voice distant like he was in a trance. She led him back to bed, but neither of them slept well that night. In the morning, the strange events were brushed off as just a bad dream, the product of overactive imaginations. But the feeling of unease lingered. The next day was overcast, the sky a dull grey that seemed to press down on them. The group decided to explore the area, hoping that some fresh air would clear their minds. They followed a trail through the woods, the trees towering above them like ancient sentinels. As they walked, they noticed something strange. The deeper they went into the forest, the quieter it became. The sounds of birds and insects faded away, leaving only the sound of their footsteps on the leaf-covered ground. The air grew colder, and a heavy fog began to roll in, obscuring their path. Jake, who had been leading the way, suddenly stopped. "Do you guys see that?" he asked, pointing ahead. Through the fog, they could just make out the shape of a building. It was another cabin, much older and in a state of disrepair. The windows were boarded up and the roof sagged in places. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. "Maybe it's abandoned," Sarah suggested, though her voice was laced with apprehension. They approached cautiously, the sense of unease growing with each step. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as it moved in the wind. Jake, always the curious one, pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was just as decayed as the outside, with broken furniture and debris scattered across the floor. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched deep into the wood. The air was thick with the smell of rot and something else, something metallic. As they explored, they found a small room at the back of the cabin. Inside was a table, and on it, a large book bound in dark leather. The cover was adorned with the same symbols that were carved into the walls. It looked old, much older than the cabin itself. Jake opened the book, revealing pages filled with strange, indecipherable text and disturbing illustrations. There were drawings of twisted, inhuman figures, surrounded by the same symbols that covered the walls. The more they looked at it, the more uneasy they felt. "This is some kind of ritual book," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma shivered, feeling a cold chill run down her spine. "We should leave," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't like this place." But as they turned to go, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The group jumped, their hearts racing. Jake rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut from the outside. Panic set in as they tried to find another way out. The windows were all boarded up and the walls were too thick to break through. They were trapped. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the cabin. The sound was coming from the shadows, moving closer with each passing second. "Get the book," Sarah yelled. "Maybe it has a way to stop this." Jake grabbed the book and began flipping through the pages frantically, but the text was unreadable, written in a language none of them recognized. The growling grew louder, and the shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing as they closed in around the group. In a desperate attempt, Jake ripped out one of the pages and threw it into the fireplace. The moment the paper touched the flames, the growling stopped, and the shadows recoiled, retreating back into the corners of the room. The door swung open, and the group didn't hesitate. They ran out of the cabin and didn't stop until they were back at their own, breathless and shaking. "What the hell was that?" Emma gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't know," Jake replied, his face pale. "But whatever it was, it didn't want us there." They decided to leave the next morning, not wanting to spend another night in the woods. But as they packed their things, they realized that the journal Sarah had found was missing. They searched the cabin, but it was nowhere to be found. "It's like it vanished," Tom said, his voice trembling. That night, the wind howled louder than ever, and the temperature plummeted. The fire refused to stay lit no matter how much wood they added. The whispers returned, louder this time, almost as if they were coming from inside the cabin. Jake stayed up late, unable to sleep. He kept hearing noises, footsteps in the hall, the sound of something moving in the walls. Around midnight, he heard a faint tapping on the window. He turned to look, but there was nothing there, just the darkness pressing against the glass. But the tapping continued, growing more insistent. He approached the window cautiously, his breath fogging up the glass. As he got closer, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, in the fogged-up glass, was the outline of a handprint. It was too large to be human, the fingers long and thin with sharp, claw-like nails. He stumbled back, his heart racing. He wanted to wake the others, but something told him not to, that if he made a sound, whatever was outside would come inside. The tapping continued for what felt like hours until it suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of silence that presses down on you, making you feel like you're suffocating. Jake didn't sleep that night. Morning came, but the sense of dread didn't lift. The group packed their things quickly, eager to leave the cabin behind. But as they loaded the car, they realized something was wrong. The road they had come in on was gone. The trail that led to the cabin now ended abruptly, swallowed up by the forest. They walked around in confusion, trying to find any sign of the road, but it was as if it had never existed. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped, with no way to call for help. Their phones had no signal, and the cabin didn't have a landline. "We'll have to walk out," Alex said, trying to stay calm. "We'll follow the trail back to where we came from. It can't have disappeared." But as they started down the trail, they found that it twisted and turned in ways they didn't remember. The fog had returned, thicker than ever, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of them. Hours passed, but they made no progress. It was as if the forest was shifting around them, keeping them trapped within its depths. "We're going in circles," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "We've passed this same tree 3 times already." Despair began to set in as they realized they were hopelessly lost. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. They decided to make camp for the night, not wanting to be caught in the dark. As they huddled around a small fire, the whispers returned, louder than ever. The voices seemed to be coming from all around them, speaking in a language none of them understood. Then, the ground beneath them began to shake. The fire flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. They could hear something moving in the shadows, something big, and it was getting closer. Jake grabbed a stick from the fire and swung it around, trying to keep whatever it was at bay, but the creature was too fast, darting in and out of the darkness. Suddenly, Tom let out a scream as something grabbed him from behind. The others turned just in time to see him being dragged into the trees, his screams echoing through the night. "Tom!" Emma screamed, but it was too late. He was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Panic set in as they realized they were being hunted. They ran, not knowing where they were going, just trying to get away from whatever was out there. But no matter how fast they ran, the creature was always right behind them, its growls echoing through the forest. Finally, they burst out of the trees and into a clearing. There, in the center of the clearing, was the old cabin they had found earlier. "We're back here," Jake gasped, his chest heaving. "How?" There was no time to question it. They ran inside, slamming the door behind them. The cabin was just as they had left it, the book still lying on the table. "We need to do something," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "That thing is going to kill us all." Jake picked up the book, flipping through the pages again. "There has to be something in here," he muttered, scanning the strange symbols and drawings. Suddenly, the door began to rattle, as if something was trying to get in. The windows shook, the glass cracking under the pressure. "We don't have much time," Alex said, his voice tight with fear. Jake found a page that looked promising, with a drawing of a symbol that seemed to match the ones on the walls. He quickly sketched it on the floor, using a piece of charcoal from the fireplace. As he completed the symbol, the cabin shook violently, the walls groaning under the strain. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, as if the very walls were speaking to them. The door burst open and the creature stepped inside. It was tall and gaunt, with pale, almost translucent skin stretched tight over its skeletal frame. Its eyes were hollow black pits, and its mouth was filled with rows of sharp, jagged teeth. But as it crossed the threshold, it stopped, staring at the symbol on the floor. It let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes narrowing. Jake grabbed the book and began reading the words aloud. Even though he didn't understand them, the creature let out a deafening roar, thrashing against the walls as if trying to escape. The cabin shook violently, the floorboards cracking under the strain. The creature lunged at Jake, but it was too late. As he finished the incantation, the symbol on the floor began to glow, filling the room with a blinding light. The creature let out one final, ear-piercing scream before it was consumed by the light, its body disintegrating into ash. The light faded, and the cabin fell silent once more. The group stood there, panting and shaken but alive. The creature was gone, banished by the ritual. But their relief was short-lived. As they stepped outside, they realized the fog had lifted, revealing the road that had been missing earlier. They hurried back to the cabin, grabbed their things, and left without looking back. The journey home was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts, trying to process what had happened. When they finally reached civilization, they went their separate ways, each promising to never speak of what had happened in the woods. But the experience haunted them. Nightmares plagued their sleep, and they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, one by one, they began to disappear. Azera was the first to go, vanishing from her apartment without a trace. Then Emma, found dead in her home, her body twisted in unnatural ways. Alex was next, his car found abandoned on a deserted road, the driver's seat covered in claw marks. Jake was the last. He knew it was only a matter of time before it came for him. He tried to fight it, to stay awake, but in the end, it didn't matter. He was found in his bed, his face frozen in a mask of terror. The book was never found, but the cabin still stands, hidden deep in the woods, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting visitors to stumble upon it. And if you ever find yourself in those woods, and you hear whispers in the wind, run. Because once you've been marked by the creature, there's no escaping its grasp. The cabin is still out there, and the creature is always waiting, hungry for its next victim. Thank you for watching. Have a good night of sleep and stay safe. Please consider subscribing, it is completely free.